Got it. Got it. All right. Hello, folks on YouTube. Hello, Zoom friends. We'll get started with our last seminar of the semester. Got that going. Hey, Andrew, record to the cloud. Got it. And we will spotlight that. All right. Welcome, everyone, to our last water, wetlands, and watersheds seminar of the semester. Today is my distinct honor to present our last speaker of the semester, Dr. Johanna Freeman. Johanna leads the terrestrial habitat research team for the Fish and Wildlife Research Institute, which is a division of the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, a state agency that is in charge of managing wildlife in the state. She has a BS in Natural Resources from Cornell University, an MS in Interdisciplinary Ecology here from SNRE at the University of Florida, and a PhD in Forest Resources and Conservation also here from UF. She's been studying the ecology and conservation of Florida terrestrial ecosystems for 15 years, and her research focuses on integrating fire ecology, plant community ecology, and landscape ecology to inform and improve conservation management. So today in particular, Dr. Freeman is going to be talking about a program to monitor restored wetlands and is seeking all of your input and feedback on the approach that the agency and her group is taking to understand whether and when a wetland is restored. So with that, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. So the title of my talk today is When is a Wetland Restored? And the announcement probably said, what is a wetland restored? And David and I agreed that kind of sounded more poetic, kind of sounds Shakespearean or something. But my question today is when is a wetland restored? And this is what we're going to be trying to answer. And as David mentioned, I work at the Fish and Wildlife Research Institute, which is a government research institute. And in many ways, our labs function like academic labs. We get external funding and publish in peer-reviewed journals, but we also function as in-house consultants to the management branches of the agency. And that's the kind of work I'm going to be talking about today. So I took over as the head of this lab 2 years ago. And when I did, I inherited this big wetland monitoring program that had been going for 5 years. The lab had, at that time, monitored 102 wetlands. Those are surveys, pretty intensive surveys, at 7 preserves since 2016.
No, sorry. We've got Dr. Bowers here. Okay. Finish that from here. And we're gonna hide this thing again. Okay, you should be back in now.
Okay. Yes. Okay, so the one big thing all of these wetlands have in common, other than being ephemeral, is that they were all historically occupied by the Flatwood salamander. There are 2 subspecies of Flatwood salamander, and both are endangered. And all of these wetlands are also undergoing restoration. So when I took this over, there was 5 years worth of data from 102 wetlands, and none of it had been analyzed yet. For various reasons, the program had gotten bogged down and there wasn't total clarity on what questions people wanted to ask of the data. So I've spent as much time as I could put toward it over the past 2 years, working with the group to clarify what questions they want to ask of this data and exploring the data and figuring out how to go about answering them, and also making some adjustments going forward to how the data is being collected to help us better answer the questions that people want to ask. So our current objectives, the agency wants to set quantitative overall plant community restoration goals, which is easier said than done, or I don't even know if it's easily said, but that is a very complicated thing to do in a scientifically valid way, and track progress toward those restoration goals. They also want to quantify parameters important to the Flatwood salamander, that's Ambystoma bishopii and Ambystoma cingulatum, and track progress towards Flatwood salamander goals. So an overview of the monitoring program. The survey method is that a grid is overlaid over the entire wetland, and it's searched subjectively for flatwood salamander habitat. The reason that is subjective is that nobody has quantified it before. And when the group started doing this 5 years ago, all of the knowledge about where they found flatwood salamander eggs was based on a handful of expert opinions and knowledge. So an expert could take you out and say, oh yeah, they like this stuff. They like this bare soil and these kind of plants that are hanging over, so the eggs drop in the water just so. So what the lab did before I joined was went out with the experts and they showed them what to look for. And they started subjectively searching all of these wetlands, and they would give each grid cell a yes or a no for whether it contained what they considered to be flatwood salamander habitat. And then within that grid, 30 cells were selected to get a plant survey quadrat. And that quadrat was more intensively sampled. Those pictures there are some of the nesting and larval habitat of the flatwood salamander. The one on the left is nesting habitat. That tends to be more ecotonal, facultative wetland species. And then the one on the right is larval habitat. Those tend to be obligate and emergent species where the larvae swim in and take cover among them. The quadrats that are sampled are a 2 meter by 2 meter quad, and they identify all of the plant species within the whole quad, both woody and herbaceous. They do woody cover estimate over the whole thing, and then herbaceous cover estimates within the quad, and that's all by specific plant species. Then they also estimate percent bare ground and percent litter cover. And those are things that are important to the flatwood salamander. Bare mineral soil especially, they need their eggs to drop onto bare mineral soil. And I'm not a herpetologist at all. So when I talk about the flatwood salamander, it's all hearsay. I'm a botanist. Okay, so those are the parameters they're taking. Approximately 18 wetlands are surveyed per year. It's a pretty consistent funding stream that has worked out to be where the crew that I'm now in charge of, which is 3 to 4 research technicians, can go out and survey 18 wetlands. And some of them are new every year, and some of them are being resampled. And on the first slide, I forgot to mention, I had some other agencies on there. These are not all on Fish and Wildlife Commission property. A lot of them are in Apalachicola National Forest. Some are at Eglin Air Force Base, and the Nature Conservancy is involved. They do a lot of work with the flatwood salamander. So there are a bunch of agencies involved, and it's kind of a big interagency working group. A big caveat going forward, in the original design, the wetlands were sampled using a stratified random sample. So when they would go to the 30 cells and select the ones for a more intensive quadrat, they were picking 15 in cells that had gotten a yes for flatwood salamander habitat and 15 in cells that had gotten a no. And the purpose of that was to try to quantify the expert opinion on what flatwood salamander was. Which was the best anyone could come up with as a way to do that. And I honestly don't have a better idea of how to do it. The problem with it is that that's stuck, and the goals for the program kind of changed, and people started wanting to do kind of overall wetland habitat and wetland vegetation quality, and wanting to describe whole wetlands. And that is not the best way to do that. It was the same sample size regardless of the size of the wetland, and there's a huge variation. Some of them might only have 30 cells, some of them might have 600 cells, and they're both getting the same number of quads. And then also putting 15 in quads where they found the habitat, those tend to be more herbaceous. That's probably underestimating herb cover in high herb wetlands and overestimating it in low herb wetlands. So we're going to be changing that going forward, but I have this huge existing data set that was collected that way. So I'm using that for exploration, but I just want everyone to remember that. And we need to take some of our conclusions with a grain of salt because of it. All right, a little bit of background on fire-dependent wetlands in the Florida Panhandle. I actually made these animation slides for fourth graders, but I have found that adults enjoy them as well. It kind of gives you a good feel for how the fire ecology works in these wetlands. So historically, when dry, these wetlands burned, they're embedded in longleaf pine savannas, which are ecosystems that experience frequent fire on the order of every 3 to 5 years. So when there's no fire, you start to get woody plant encroachment all through the basin, especially on the edges, but also through the basin. Those woody plants drop litter, in many cases non-flammable litter. That litter prevents fire and it also suppresses herb cover underneath. It changes parameters that are important to amphibians in terms of being all stages of their life cycle. And it changes the whole plant community composition and the fire ecology. When you get fire, when you have repeated fires, it takes out the woody species, it diminishes them, and if you have a lot of recurrent fires, they can actually be almost extirpated. And what you get is a herbaceous wetland, which is more favorable for amphibians in general. So restoration of this system involves physically going in and taking out woody encroachment, because there's been a lot of fire suppression in the past 100 years. And they just don't burn is the thing that we hear from most people. There's a lot of will among the managing agencies to burn them, but what'll happen is they'll burn the uplands and the fire just stops when it gets to the ecotone. Now we do have some that burn really well, and you'll see where those fall out in the data. But the restoration of work that is going on is removal of hardwoods and also scraping of the soil surface to remove litter and expose mineral soil for the salamanders.
You recognize these people coming in, right? It's Christine.
Oh. Okay, now if you don't get repeated fire or fire surrogates, this gets worse and it gets harder and harder to restore. And they get really, really woody, and there's almost no herb cover and very little amphibian activity. And it also changes the hydrology. That's something else I didn't mention. When the fires go through, they burn peat as well, which lowers the wetland surface and contributes to the ephemeral wetland hydrology. Okay. So moving on to setting restoration goals for these systems, we have to ask what makes a good ephemeral wetland. One thing that we're interested in is amphibian occupancy. That might be overall community diversity, or it might be the occupancy of specific species of concern, like the Flatwood salamander. That in turn depends on vegetation composition, presence of bare soil, hydroperiod, the suitability of the surrounding upland matrix. They spend, a lot of amphibians spend the adult portion of their lives in the uplands, and then they go in to breed in the ephemeral wetlands. So the uplands get hardwood encroached as well. And there's a lot of variability in how suitable they are for amphibians. So you could have a great ephemeral wetland in the midst of a not great upland, and you might not get the amphibians you want. That distance to other wetlands also plays into that with metapopulation dynamics. We're also interested in plant community composition and diversity. Even though it's a Fish and Wildlife Agency, they are also very concerned with just overall ecosystem integrity and managing for characteristic old growth plant communities. One component of that might be proportions of obligate, facultative, and upland species that would likely change as we undergo restoration, would be lost due to shrub encroachment. The presence of specialists and rare or uncommon species, those things tend to get extirpated as things degrade. We want a good fire carrying structure, which depends on having herbaceous fine fuels present and not a lot of woody fuels and not a lot of suppressive litter. So one thing that has been my focus after having familiarized myself with the ecology and with the data set is using simple herbaceous cover of all species lumped together as a proxy variable for amphibian and plant habitat quality. When we start to get into more detailed questions, we run into a lot of these other factors that we would need to control for or take into account if we wanted to actually assess habitat quality for specific species. So using herb cover, I started becoming interested in whether can we just have a simple proxy that would be legitimate, that we could measure in all these wetlands and would stand in as kind of an overall benchmark for wetland quality. Overall herb cover is a correlate of wetland occupancy for a lot of amphibian species. There's quite a few papers showing that. And it's also a likely correlate of plant diversity in these systems. It is in many others. And I haven't looked at that a whole lot in this data set yet, but it tends to be a correlate of overall plant diversity. And also fire facilitation. Herb cover is just fundamental to fire facilitation, which drives a whole lot of these other things. So in many ways, it is the single most important parameter in these wetlands. When I decided to pursue herbaceous cover, what I did is I took all of the wetlands and I just simply put them all on a graph together, just to get an eyeful of what the differences are between these wetlands in their herb cover. So what this is showing is 102 wetlands sorted from high to low average herb cover. And the square black dot is the mean for the whole wetland from those 30 quads that we took. And then the lines with the dots at the end are the minimum to maximum ranges. So you can see they're very heterogeneous. Among those 30 quads, each wetland has a huge range where some of the quads have no herb cover, some of them have a ton. And overall, though, there is pretty big differences in the average, and those mins and maxes do go along with it. So one big thing in setting restoration goals, which is something that management managers and agencies always want to do, is coming up with categories. It's often very useful to come up with categories. So I started thinking, can we come up with some herb cover categories and group the wetlands that way? And would that be meaningful for some of these other things we're interested in? So I decided to assign as a starting point 4 categories: very low, low, medium, and high. The low is within 1 standard deviation below the mean, medium is 1 standard deviation above, and then high is greater than 1, very low is less than 1. And that just gave me something to work with and to move forward with exploring whether a categorization system like this might work for scoring our wetland quality. Could you give me a time check? I know.
You have 32 minutes.
Oh, great. Okay, so as I said, I've put as much time toward this as I could, and I had a technician last year who's now gone on to grad school, but he was really interested in helping me out with some of the stats. So he did some of this exploratory analysis for me, working with a statistician at our lab. And we decided to do some modeling to see whether straight herb cover was related to other things we were interested in. And so he looked for collinearity between all of these variables that the lab had collected over the 5 years. And he dropped out variables that had greater relationship of greater than 0.5. And most of them stayed in. There was not a ton of collinearity in there, but out of that group, he ended up picking 6 variables, which are down there at the bottom. And then he had herb cover as a response variable, all of the others as predictor variables. And he chose the model that had the lowest AIC. And with that, we ended up with woody cover, obligate wetland species cover, Shannon diversity, and average litter cover as the 4 explanatory variables. So from there, I went and looked at comparing between these groups. So just to conclude a little more on that slide, what that says to me is that these other parameters that we're interested in, herb cover does have a relationship with them. So it's worth pursuing this further, looking at herb cover as our guiding variable. We've got all these other things that that do relate to herb cover. So I've got our 4 categories here with the ranges and means, and then I compared between the categories. And this is with there's a Tukey's HSD test between categories. Obligate wetland herb cover was significantly different between the high and the very low and low categories. Same for woody cover. Same for plant diversity, and same for litter. Now, some of the smaller gradations between low and very low, medium, high, there were not significant differences for the most part between any of those. So I think the conclusion there is what we really have is 2 meaningful categories, at least as far as these variables that we have to work with are concerned. And I haven't actually looked at just 2 categories yet, but it looks to me like we probably have 2 meaningful categories. And if we have like medium to high herb cover in a wetland, you really have a different type of wetland that's got higher plant diversity and lower litter and more obligate species. And it's probably correlates with hydrology and all these other things we aren't measuring but are interested in. And the same goes for the low and very low. Those look to be like they're probably going to be really woody dominated and have a whole different suite of variables. And Scott also did principal components analysis using those 5 variables of interest. And that pretty much supports everything that I just said. We do see a separation among groups from high to low, especially between the high and very low. There's a lot of overlap between those gradations. In general, what we see is that with more herb cover, we also get more obligate wetland plant cover, higher plant diversity, lower woody cover, and lower litter. And we don't really have the means to determine cause and effect from the data set that we have, but it is certainly something we can do more of going into the future. And one thing of note in here is that the highest per quadrat Shannon indexes were actually at medium high levels of herb cover, which I think is probably because there are more woody species in there. The really herb dominated wetlands are almost like just a putting green of green vegetation and not a lot of shrubs. So it's probably that woody species are contributing to the diversity there. So moving on to some Flatwood salamander parameters. This is another big item of interest for FWC. And I also think it can serve as an example of how we might use this data for other amphibians too that have different habitat needs. Because we're pulling out specific plant species, we can look at all kinds of different things. And when it comes to the Flatwood salamander, it's a very, very finicky salamander, and they need to use specific plant species. So we've got a whole list of their larval cover species. We got a list of their nesting cover species, and then we've also got the bare mineral soil. So we did some exploration looking at how to categorize and evaluate wetlands with regard to their vegetation suitability for Flatwood salamanders. And it is specifically vegetation suitability. There's lots of other stuff that matters for them, especially hydroperiod, that we're not measuring. But what we're trying to do is to be able to say something about the vegetation. That's the thing we have the most control over. People can actually go in there and remove shrubs and apply fire. It's also probably the easiest thing to measure, short of amphibians themselves, which I'll get into a little bit more. So we did PCA with that too, with just 3 variables: larval cover, nesting cover, and bare ground. Those are kind of the 3 most important elements for them. And we did k-means clustering. Those ellipses are based on k-means clusters. And what we see is a gradient from low to high, nesting cover and bare ground. Those 2 things tend to go hand in hand. which I think says a lot that we'll want to look into more. It's basically having to do with fire. Fire in ecotones is exposing bare mineral soil and is creating more herbaceous nesting cover. And then we also see a gradient from low to high larval cover. And looking at these clusters, I decided to describe them as 4 suitability groups. So we've got our highest suitability wetlands that have high nesting cover, high larval cover. Lowest suitability, low nesting and low larval. And then we had one type of mixed suitability, which was high nesting and low larval. And those, I suspect, are shallower wetlands. When I look at the pictures of those, they some of them don't even really look like a wetland. It's just vegetated all the way through. And that larval cover is dependent on having an actual like flooded area. Then we have this other type of mixed suitability, which is low nesting and high larval. In those, I suspect they are probably deeper wetlands because you can get woody stuff all the way up to the edge and then a basin that's flooded. This is all ripe for some hydrologists to help me with it, which is part of why I'm presenting this today, because we're just there's so much there that we would like to know. And this specific program I'm working on is what it is. And part of my role also is to bring in collaborators and do kind of side projects to answer some of these deeper questions. And just to reiterate there, this is vegetation suitability only for these salamanders. They're actually so endangered, they don't even let them try to fill their life cycle in the wild. They collect all the eggs and hatch them in captivity and then go release the larvae into the wild. And going back and looking, we did this principal components analysis and then went back to the salamander biologists, and it does seem that yes, those ones that we are declaring high suitability based on just these parameters do overlap a lot with where they're finding salamanders, with some exceptions. There is one at Escribano Point, which is down in the lowest suitability group. And that is a huge, really woody wetland that's got one little part that's herbaceous, and the salamanders are breeding in there. So that kind of calls into question this approach where we're trying to declare a whole wetland high and low suitability. And I'm going to get into a little bit more. I'm going to be trying to do a better job with actually describing the wetlands well. So this is really just a start for thinking about how we would do this, how we would categorize things. And overall, everyone in this working group agreed, like, this is kind of it's a good path to follow, but we need to do more work. Okay, and as far as the Flatwood salamander goes, we don't have a very promising way to validate any of this with salamander occupancy, and that's just because there are so few of them. We don't have enough replication of wetlands in which they occur, and also they really don't like us to be in there with the eggs and larvae. And so I mean, the obvious thing to do would be to go to where there's eggs and put down a plant quad and characterize that, but they really don't want us to do that because there's so few of them and it's disturbing. So we're trying to get at it in a little bit more tangential ways.
Just for context, like of those 102, how many do you know, like what proportion that are occupied? Is it like just a handful of those, or you have no idea? Is it one?
That's a really good question. It is, I am just gonna throw a number out there. I want to say maybe like 30 or something. It's not nothing, but they're also spatially very clustered. Apalachicola National Forest just is like the stronghold. And there are different types of wetlands. That's something I meant to mention earlier. Some of them are tie-tie as far as woody stuff goes. Some are tie-tie dominated. Some have other shrubs. They have different characteristics. So there's kind of like a cluster in Apalachicola National Forest, and it's all kind of the same type of stuff, and the salamanders there. But yeah, it's not like there's only 3 or 4 occupied wetlands. There are more than that. And here also I kind of followed the same path. I then looked at, what are Now that we've identified these categories, can we look at their properties and see, is this really a category that has different descriptors that go with it? So I looked at these other important structural variables other than nesting cover, larval cover, and bare ground. And we did find significantly lower levels of shrub and litter cover in our highest suitability wetlands. Very high litter cover in this one particular type of mixed suitability with the low nesting and high larval. It's probably because they're so woody and they don't burn around the ecotone. And then between the lowest suitability and the mixed that had low larval and high nesting, we didn't find any significant differences. So going forward, this is the first year we did this. I came up with a new sampling method, and a lot of these wetlands are being repeated. Something else about the original sampling method was that they would go to the yes and no cells, and it's a 10 meter by 10 meter cell, so it's huge. And since they were trying to quantify the salamander habitat, if it got a yes, they would look around for where there was a patch of the herbaceous stuff that the salamanders need and go put the quad on top of that. And in a no cell, there might actually be some herb cover, and they would go look for a bare spot and put the quad on top of that. So obviously for trying to describe wetlands, we going forward, now that we kind of are clearer that we want to be able to describe whole wetlands really well, we needed to change that. So our new method, we have scaled to wetland size, and we're proportionally sampling within zones. We divided the wetlands into 10 meter zones based on the distance from the edge. And then we're sampling 25% of the cells at their center point. So that'll be a repeated measurement at the center point using a 2 meter by 2 meter quad. And it's the same, we're going to collect the same parameters as before. We're going to do a minimum of 15 quads per wetland and a maximum of 60. Some of these are really huge, and we can't do 25% of the cells. There's kind of a set amount of funding that goes with this. So as is often the case with research, there's our sample size is logistically driven. We're doing our best to get up there and sample our bigger wetlands better, but there's funding logistics involved. And then we've got a minimum of 15 because some of them are really tiny and they probably only get 10 points. And we just wanted a larger number for our statistics. And then I added a new herbaceous cover estimate that's over an entire 10 by 10 cell, which is quite large, but we tested it out, and the technician said they felt it was doable and reasonably accurate. So I'm looking forward to having that, since I have just seen a lot of support in our data and in the literature for using plain old herb cover as a proxy variable. We're going to be able to come out. They've been to every single cell in these, and I'm thinking we can do like a heat map that's showing the percent herb cover over the whole wetland, and then over time we would see that hopefully change with restoration. All right. Okay, so as far as setting benchmarks, there is a lot of desire to have quantitative vegetation goals, as in managers, you should be striving to have at least 40% herb cover, an average of at least 40% herb cover in the quads we put down in your wetlands. You should be striving to have, only such and such amount of shrub cover. And that gets difficult to do because we need it to be tied to things that matter. We need to be tied to outcomes, amphibian outcomes, plant outcomes, and that takes time. It takes time and data and really experimentation. There's just a lot of gray area in there, but it is something that they really want to pursue, and understandably so. There's a lot of money being spent. And this is the question that always comes up from the managers, which is, how do we know when it's done? How do we know when the wetland is restored? And there's only so much that we can go out there and measure that will be meaningful feedback to them. So based on all that exploratory analysis I showed you, I'm thinking, can we say, as a, sort of a tentative goal that we want 50% plus herb cover. That would be our medium and high herb cover categories. And in putting this forward, because things do tend to get set in stone in government, I would only be willing to say that if we really said this is tentative and it's pending collecting, validating data in the future. But this product has been going on for 7 years now, because I took it over 2 years ago. And in some ways that's nice for me, because like I'm coming in, I'm able to look at all the problems and just say, oh, well, my predecessors did that. Like now I know how to fix everything. On the other hand, it's been going on for 7 years and people are really anxious to get some of the results out of it. So, I'm kind of on the hook to provide something to them that is gonna be a guiding benchmark going forward. So, and this is something, I'm hoping we have some time for discussion at the end, putting out there, would it be valid to say we want to aim for 50% herb cover? Should we set goals for litter cover and woody cover? We did see that those were correlated with herb cover. Cause and effect, we really have not determined yet, but we could, going forward, we could put tentative litter cover and woody cover goals out there and say that we'll revise them as we collect validating data. We would, we do need to establish cause and effect there. It's often the case in fire ecology that what we see turns out to be correlation rather than causation. So we need to be really careful of that. So with this new sampling scheme, we can track spatial change in cover within zones. So in ecotone and in the basin, would it be possible to set goals by zone, and might they be related to flammability and fire effects? Those ecotones are really a big problem for woody encroachment. Like I said, the managers often find that the fire just stops at the edge of the wetland. So that's just a very important part of facilitating fire. One thing I'm really curious about is, are there tipping points in herb cover where you really could say, like, yes, we see that you need to have this much, the wetlands that burn have this much herb cover in the ecotone. I mentioned we've definitely got different types of wetlands. I didn't get into that at all. I haven't really gotten into it in my exploration, and I didn't show it today. But different wetlands we would likely have different goals for them. They have a different potential depending on their type. And then with Flatwood salamander goals, I'm thinking, going forward, can we just say we want to see our wetlands move toward the highest suitability group? And I didn't show it, but that group did contain the preponderance of wetlands that are occupied. And I feel like that's kind of the best we could do at this point, because that occupancy is so hard to measure, and it's also dependent on a lot of other things, meta populations and whatnot. So in general, validating this with animal data, I would really like to do that. And this could be just amphibian and invertebrate surveys. I'd really like to just look at amphibian community diversity in these different wetland types and over time, and potentially aquatic invertebrates too. To do that well, we'd want to control for other contributing factors like surrounding landscape and metapopulations, which, that would really necessitate an actual research project. It would not really be possible to fold into my monitoring program, but I would love to do that. And in conclusion, I really just, for one thing, I have a lot of paid seasonal opportunities. That can be for students and technicians. I get a lot of people from UF. So if anybody has students or recent graduates who might be interested in being a technician for me, that'd be great. And if anyone has students who might be interested in helping me actually do some of this research, that would be great too. So that's all I have today.
All right, well, let's give a round of applause to Dr. Freeman. So that's great. We have about 10 minutes for questions, questions and feedback. So what I'm going to do is
I'm going to go back to my slide that had this stuff.
Okay. Great. So we'll start in the room, and then I'll ask for some questions from the YouTube and the Zoom. So we'll start in here.
My pleasure. Yeah, this is a really nice talk. Really, thank you for sharing that. So I have two questions about, because the focus was on wetland function, the salamanders in particular, for like animal habitat. So I have two related questions. So one is that kind of smaller scale, or a kind of taxonomic scale, I guess, is there potentially conflict between, targeting restoration for salamander's sake, but potentially degrading the habitat for other animals that are using the habitat? So for example, if you get rid of all the woody vegetation, you might get fewer like woodpeckers or something. So can it be like, can you go too far in the salamander direction? And then also, what's your thoughts about function as a animal habitat versus other functions like carbon sequestration? You mentioned hydrology being modified too. And so just like what your thoughts are about those kind of conservation or restoration goals.
Yeah, so the first question, I would say absolutely yes. There are almost always winners and losers when we do restoration. And amphibians are, well, the flatwood salamander specifically is endangered. So we're mandated to restore habitat for them. So there's that, like that's just kind of happening no matter what.
Right.
And then from there, as an agency, FWC wishes that it could just restore for everything. And I actually kind of imposed amphibians on them as a group specifically because of what you're saying. And also, because everything has different needs. And there absolutely would be birds that probably would like to have more trees there and things like that. But for amphibians, they require ephemeral wetlands. And so they seem like an obvious target group to me to focus on. And also ephemeral wetlands in general are they have decreased in their extent in the panhandle from fire suppression, and I think also maybe climate.
This kind of up and down, but yeah.
Okay, so yeah, and it would just be great to validate this with all kinds of animal data and see if there are losers, see who they are, and also see are the ones who are intended to be winners actually winning from this. With your second question, I would be really curious about those things, carbon sequestration. It's not within my purview at Fish and Wildlife, but that stuff, if anyone was interested in looking at that, I would welcome, joining me, and like I'd be happy to share data and have people look at that. And the agency generally welcomes that kind of thing, as long as they're not paying for it. If it involves animals, we generally have quite a bit of funding to spend on restoring habitat and studying it. But
So it seems like this idea of moving the wetlands to the highest suitability groups, where the suitability had larval habitat, nesting habitat, bare ground, right, as these major drivers. But then you showed that there's a super wide range, like a large wetland that had like a nice little pocket. And so moving that whole wetland sort of is probably hard. Have you thought about thinking not just like moving the sort of mean of the quadrat or mean of the cells in that direction, but like the range? So like increasing the range so that there may be a large wetland that 80% of it is not correct, but like that, a couple of spots where you might get the correct habitat or highest suitability as a goal. You don't really need to worry about going and like destroying, 80% of the wetland that has nice, woody cover or whatever, but getting a chunk into the right zone.
yes, and in fact, they do restore them that way with the really big ones. Some of them they'll take a slice and focus on woody removal and in just that slice and work on restoring that.
Or an area weighted, so as opposed to the mean, but just like the high, sort of like an area weighted average or something of the high suitability is increased, right? Not so the whole wetland doesn't need to be scored A+, but it has to include some A+.
Yeah, so I have thought about how to go about, kind of setting goals for that, because we could have quadrat level goals for, how much herb cover. And I did think about that and kept coming back to whole wetlands, partly because of the fire ecology, I think. I guess like the fire ecology and hydrology, unless you're talking really massive, a wetland is kind of a thing in and of itself. And they are managed that way too. So as far as prioritizing over, we're gonna restore some wetlands, we're gonna restore this one and that one. They are kind of treated as their own management unit. So yeah, that's imperfect, and it would be really good to have quadrant level goals and maybe also zone goals. And as soon as I would start diving into that, it would start to get complicated with like, well, how do you come up with that? And it probably depends on whether or not it matters, depends on what the rest of the wetland is like.
And you don't have bathymetry for these wetlands, so yeah, your zones are about distance from the edge, but for all you know, it's deepest at the, I mean, in reality, it could be deep at the edge and shallow in the middle. You don't know the shape of
Right.
these basins, right?
Right.
So that's a challenge.
I mean, we can infer it from, I'm hoping we can infer some of it from the plant
Yeah.
species that we find in the zones.
Back to the room for more questions. Yeah, go ahead, Calvin.
Thank you, Joanna, for the talk. Just wondering about the data question regarding the herbaceous coverage. What does it mean when it over like 100%? Like,
Yes, yet another thing I meant to explain. So I got to that herb cover by adding up the individual species covers, and they often overlap each other. So you got like a small herbaceous thing, and then there's a grass that's over it. And because the technicians have estimated it, oh, this one's 1% and that one's 10, but it's overlapping, those would add up to 11. So it's really not so much like how much of the ground area is covered if you were looking at it, but just it's kind of more of almost a proxy for biomass. It's kind of how I think of it, because yeah, to say like 200% cover is silly.
But you could have
But-
leaves here and leaves here and leaves here, like a tree has more than one, like many layers and can have more.
Yeah.
So we have a question from your FWC colleague, Joe Marciano. So he asks, are you able to use any remote sensing methods for the monitoring? So to look at change in herb cover, or I suppose woody cover over time, with this like super high, relatively high resolution, high temporal resolution, remote sensing is there to benchmark your field crew.
I would love to. I would absolutely love to do that. And yes, it is absolutely something I have thought about.
I was
And
looking for someone to do it.
no, I mean, yeah, that kind of thing. It would be the group that I work with that funds this is very much set on only measuring plants that humans can go physically measure on the ground. When they welcome add-on stuff, I propose a lot of this add-on stuff, and they would welcome it, but I would need to find partnership and colleagues to do some of that, but that would be wonderful. I would love to have LiDAR for the structure, and potentially other types of remote sensing, looking at like maybe greenness, and it'd be a great way to do this.
I mean, your cells are 10 meter, right? And then
Yeah.
Sentinel-2 and is 10 meter.
Mhm.
And woody cover can always be confusing because if it gets in the way of like understanding, but you want to know about woody cover too. So I think it's like almost a no-brainer. It's just you're gonna have the field data, so it'd be easy to check and see whether the remote sense data lines up with your observations in the field.
Yeah,
Definitely, we should think about that.
yeah.
So we have one more question from YouTube. This is from Barish Yildirim. So how would you address invasive plant cover for any kind of rule passed about a certain, needing 50% or more cover? For example, in historically herbaceous wetland, would the restoration be more successful with the right herbaceous cover, but the right amount, but half of it was some invasive species or something?
That's a very good question. We don't have a ton of invasive species in these, is the simple answer. So I just have not had to contend with it very much. They are kind of out, way out in these natural areas, and invasives just don't penetrate in there that much, even if they're along the roadsides. And I think I have, it's something I've always wondered about and continue to in longleaf pine savannas. They are just not very invaded. If there were to be invasives, I would say we would probably still set those herb cover goals, but would just, we'd want to put a big asterisk next to it and say, but actually we need to get rid of some of this.
All right, last chance for a question for Dr. Freeman. Yes, Karthik.
Thank you so much, man, for this presentation. I mean, before I used to think like, whenever wildfire, like, or some episodes like this, I was thinking and only like how it impacts air pollution. But I never thought in ecological aspect. That's really nice. Yeah. I have like a quick question about this. This research is like carried out for all year or just specific, like, months of the year?
So this is, yeah, it's just once a year, so it's a snapshot. It's collected, between August and October every year.
Oh, thank you so much.
All right, well, if you have any further ideas about doing a PhD chapter or about how to quantify woody cover or whatever, then you can let me know. I'll get you in touch with Dr. Freeman, and let's give her another round of applause. All right, so you just have one more write-up due and you'll be done. I think you all are on track for getting your passing grade. Let me know if you have any issues, but I've been returning your reviews to you, so we should all be good. And if I don't see you again, I will hopefully you have a great break and I'll see you next semester.